Hello and welcome to episode 213 of Zilog and Moto. I'm your humble host Dave, and this week I'm going to be looking at a game that I think is somewhat interesting in the Genesis library. And it's a game that I just finally picked up a complete copy of a few months ago, the last time I was in Atlanta. Based on the title of this video though, you might be wondering what on earth could possibly be interesting about a multi-platform edutainment title that was released on just about every platform possible, including the Master System, of which I covered that version previously 100 episodes ago. And, okay, maybe you're right, maybe it's not that interesting per se, but finding a complete copy of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, or Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego for that matter, is not the easiest thing in the world. More on that in a minute, but first a brief intro for everyone who isn't familiar with the channel. If this is your first visit to the channel, welcome, and I am glad you're here. Zilog and Moto is a channel that I created to house reviews of my 8 and 16-bit Sega collection, so that I could put all of these titles here to work and not just have them sitting on the shelves collecting dust. And man, they do collect dust. The cheap carpets in here is terrible. But anyway, about 7 years ago, I decided that I wanted to collect every game that I could reasonably play using a Sega Genesis as the base, and then be able to read what's on the screen. So that means at Zilog and Moto, I'm attempting to play and review about 1,280 titles from the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD, and the 32X, and showcase not just game footage captured from original hardware whenever possible, but also look at these packages to give an idea of what it was like to maybe pick one of these off the shelf 30 years ago at your favorite Electronics Boutique, Toys R Us, or Blockbuster. And just the fact that none of those stores that I just mentioned, they no longer exist, it really reminds me that I should probably start looking for cemetery plots. Yeah. Okay, joke about me being older than dirt out of the way. Let's get back to that elusive master thief Carmen Sandiego and her associates at Vile, which apparently stands for the Villains International League of Evil. Yeah, probably just best to go with Vile. That name is a bit awkward. You'd think that master criminals could come up with a better name for their group, but who knows, maybe that is why they are criminals, because they're angry about being bad with wordplay. Anyway, if you grew up in the late 80s to early 90s, there's a better than average chance that you are familiar with hunting for Carmen, due to the massive popularity of the game series bearing her name, that began back in 1985 with releases for the Apple II and DOS of the original version of Where in the World, and that were also followed by sequels like Where in the USA, Where in Europe, Where in Time, and Where in America's Past is Carmen Sandiego, before circling back to a deluxe edition of the original game. And yes, I know I skipped the blockbuster release Where in North Dakota is Carmen Sandiego, but I figured that that one was so popular that I didn't need to discuss it, much like North Dakota normally is. The series' seemingly evergreen popularity at the time led to the game being re-released for more advanced home computers as enhanced editions, starting in 1988 for the Macintosh, and it was that enhanced edition version that would eventually be ported to the Sega Genesis in September of 1992 by Electronic Arts. EA, of course, was a master of porting games that had previously been hits on home computers to the Genesis, but could they pull that off again with a game that was technically 7 years old at that point? Well, we shall see. But first, a look at that admittedly well-worn package.
And this is my copy of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego for the Genesis. Fun fact, the Sandiego in Carmen Sandiego's name is all one word, and not just San Diego, as in the name of the city. Not sure why that is. I'm assuming it was just a stylistic choice, but maybe you can win a bar bet with that bit of trivia someday, who knows. The Genesis version of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, much like the previous home computer releases of the game and the later Super Nintendo version, has a little something extra included with it, and as a result, a complete copy of the game will come in this oversized cardboard box. Now, clearly this copy has seen better days, unfortunately, but these days, finding a totally complete copy with this box can be pretty rare. Prior to this summer, I think I'd only seen it in person once since I've been collecting, and of course I didn't pick it up at the time, which is a problem because if you can find it on eBay, it's going to be going for triple digits. For example, as of the writing of this script, I'm seeing one listed for $140 and that's by far the cheapest copy that I've seen. Luckily, I found this one the last time I was in Atlanta, and it was a steal at only $45, so I didn't really give the condition a second thought. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the outer box because it's pretty fragile, and for the most part, the graphics are the same as what's on the actual clamshell. But I do want to point out what I think is one of the main reasons for the game getting a home console release in 1992, and that is the fact that the game show based on the game was at the height of its popularity at the time. So re-releasing the game on current consoles just made sense. As far as the front cover goes, the artwork is the same as that was used on the original 1985 version of the game, albeit slightly tweaked with the name in the lower portion as to match up better with the other Electronic Arts releases on the Genesis. And I think that's fine. This is one of those games where I think that they nailed the art the first time, and it didn't need to be messed with. However, having said that, Europe's version is uncropped and takes up almost the entire front cover, and I definitely prefer that look, but they're both great. Flipping over to the rear cover, and this layout is unique for this particular version. I really like what they did with the screenshots and the caption format, and yeah, those screenshots could have been a little bit better quality. They are oddly grainy for some reason. But I think they selected a good variety to show off a game that can definitely look a bit samey after a while. The bullet points in the upper right hit all the high points and do a great job of selling the game, under the guise of a want ad for employment at Acme Detective Agency. I think my one complaint is down at the bottom. The game is referred to as a 16-bit cartridge and an 8-meg cart, and while that's totally accurate, if you're not looking close, it's easy to think that this is a 16-meg game rather than 8, and that was clearly done on purpose. Tricky, EA. Opening up the case, and I love how the manual is stylistically different from a traditional manual, with the cover looking and feeling like fake leather. The manual itself is great and explains the game well with plenty of screenshots, and even includes dossiers for each of the 10 criminals you'll be hunting at the end, which isn't totally necessary since most of that information is available in-game, but I still like it being included here. Last but not least, the reason why the big box version of the game is needed, and that is the included 1992 edition of the World Almanac. World Almanacs aren't commonly seen these days, with basically all of the information included in the palm of most people's hands these days in your phone, but in the early 90s, these things were critical if you wanted to know, say, the capital of Yugoslavia and didn't have the ability to carry around a 22-volume encyclopedia. And believe it or not, still technically useful for playing the game because, as you might have imagined, certain things about the world have changed a little bit in the last 30 years. But more on that in a bit. For now, let's get to hunting a master thief and her gang. If you're not familiar with the Carmen Sandiego series, well, frankly, I find that a bit difficult to believe, just due to the numerous games released over the last almost 40 years at this point, featuring the character and her associates at Vile. But let's just say that for whatever reason you missed out, you probably are a bit confused and have questions like, what are these games all about? And who is this Carmen person that can't spell her last name correctly? And this is a video game that spawned a game show? Isn't that usually the other way around? And finally, what am I doing with my life, where watching this video is a good use of my time? Okay, that last one cuts a little bit deep, so let's refocus for a minute. Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego specifically is an edutainment title aimed at elementary and middle school age children with the goal of trying to teach kids different problem-solving skills, like paying attention to details and process of elimination, while also giving kids a reason to research and learn facts relating to world geography. Later games would focus on other, more specific areas of the world, such as the United States or Europe, and then add in lessons on history as well, with the player also having to travel to specific time periods in their hunt. But this review is focusing just on that first title that started it all. As was common at the time, with the rapid advancement of technology and home computers during the 80s and early 90s, with Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego being a popular title, it would see multiple releases that took advantage of the more powerful computer hardware available. The main Where in the World title actually saw 3 different releases on home computers, with the original one first appearing in 1985, and then the enhanced version in 1988, and then finally the deluxe version in 1992, which saw the game expanded to include more features and to take advantage of the multimedia capabilities of the burgeoning CD-ROM. Even though the Genesis version of the game was released in September of 1992, around the time of that deluxe version release on the PC, it's only technically a port of the older, enhanced version of the game, and not the deluxe version. Which makes sense because the deluxe version of the game was designed specifically for multimedia PCs at the time, with VGA graphics and digital speech synthesis that the current at the time consoles simply couldn't compete with. If you're curious, there's examples of gameplay of that deluxe version on YouTube, and you can see pretty quickly what I'm talking about as to why it wouldn't have worked on the Genesis. Just the lower resolution alone would have been a problem, much less any of the other features. Having said all that, you might be thinking, oh yay, a port of a 4-year-old PC game, how exciting, with just as much sarcasm as you can muster. And yeah, it would be understandable for fans of the game to not be so thrilled with the concept of playing what's, in reality, just a slightly prettier version of the game that originated from before even the Master System was released. However, you've got to remember that what the PC landscape was like at the time. Tons of people did not have home computers, and even if they did have a DOS-based home computer specifically in 1992, chances are it was one that wasn't brand new, meaning it didn't have the multimedia capabilities that the game was pushing. In short, unless your family was well off, if you wanted to play Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego in any form, you could do much worse than the Genesis version, which at least had the benefit of no loading times due to being on a cartridge-based medium. One of the reasons why Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego gained so much popularity amongst kids is its simplicity, and that gameplay is fully intact on the Genesis version. In fact, other than some minor graphical tweaks, the game plays exactly the same as the previous home computer versions, complete with the same menus, so anyone who had played the game before would be able to almost immediately pick up and play the game, even without a glance at the manual. However, even if you had never played a Carmen Sandiego game before, the game is still beautifully simple. You start out with the game as a rookie for the Acme Detective Agency, who has apparently been deputized by Interpol to investigate a thieving crime syndicate that operates worldwide, stealing everything from an antique Argentinian gaucho costume, to the Sultan of Moroni's perfume bottle, to even the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It's best not to ask questions, just remember the audience that they were going for and roll with it. And in all seriousness, I do like the designer's slightly slapstick sense of humor. It fits the game well, and specifically for the crimes you're investigating, if the crime was just stealing the crown jewels or the Mona Lisa or some other valuable thing that's been done over and over again, wouldn't that be a bit boring? When investigating the crime, there's two key things that you have to figure out. Who did it, and which way did they go? For all of the crimes, it's known that one of the people working for the vile syndicate did it, but you can't exactly put out an arrest warrant for just anyone and expect to make the arrest, so it's time to start questioning the witnesses. Each city you visit has 3 locations to search, which change depending on the visit. Sometimes you're investigating a bank, other times it's a hotel. The game does a good job of mixing up the locations so it doesn't feel like you're just looking at the same 3 places in each city. I think one of my favorites was when you check out a local museum and you end up interviewing a docent, which I'll readily admit that I was this week old when I learned that a docent is apparently a name for a person who conducts tours of museums and discusses the exhibits with the guests. Apparently, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego is edutainment for all ages. When you visit the various locations, the person you interview will give you a clue as to where the criminal you're after is heading next, and if you're lucky, they will also give you a clue as to the identity of the criminal by revealing one of their characteristics. Using those clues, you can check out the dossiers of each of the criminals to determine which one you're after by process of elimination. Or you can put the characteristics into the crime computer for it to do the work for you. And if you have enough to isolate which criminal you're after, a warrant will be issued for the arrest of said criminal. It's at this point you can concentrate on just catching the criminal by tracking down their path across the globe via the various clues. And this is actually an important strategy because everything you do in the game takes time. For each criminal, you only have a week or so to catch them, and the further you get into the game, it becomes more and more important to not waste any hours you don't have by performing unnecessary investigations. Or the second worst mistake that you can make, choosing to go to the wrong next destination on the map because you didn't interpret a clue correctly. This is especially bad because you can't just pick to travel anywhere. You have to fly back to the city that you were in before and then fly to the correct location. But chances are, by the time you figure out that you're in the wrong place, you will have already investigated at least one location in the wrong city, and have the person there rub salt in the wound by saying something like, "Sorry, I've never seen anyone by that description before, idiot." Well, okay, they don't say the idiot part. This is a game aimed at school children after all. But you can just tell. They're thinking, what kind of moron detective confuses Port Moresby with Kigali? I say that's the second worst mistake that you can make because technically all that does is waste time. And if you're a good player, you can usually recover from one wrong flight and still complete an investigation on time. The worst mistake that you can make is finger the wrong person. Maybe you accidentally read a clue wrong and think that a person is driving a limo instead of a convertible, or that they have red hair instead of brown, or even that they like wearing fancy jewelry instead of one large ring. Whatever the case may be, you can totally get a warrant issued for the wrong criminal, and if you do, you won't know until you catch up with them, only to have to let them go because you picked out the wrong thief and don't have a valid warrant. The shame, it's very real. Admittedly, the game can be a bit repetitive, with every case being solved the same way, and the end goal is to simply work your way up the detective ladder, gaining ranks after a certain number of crimes apprehended, with the goal to eventually solve 30 cases and bring down the ringleader of the operation, one Carmen Sandiego. Thankfully, you don't have to solve 30 cases in a row, as the game does feature a password continue system with 3-character passwords. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for simple passwords in the absence of battery backup, and it makes sense they wouldn't need to be too complicated to save your progress in this type of game, but it's definitely a unique system to be sure. From a graphics perspective, don't expect too much from this, being that it's an edutainment title. However, I did like each of the digitized pictures that were used to represent each city. Considering the color palette of the Genesis, I thought they actually came out looking pretty good. Although I could certainly see someone making an argument in favor of the hand-drawn artwork that's used in the DOS, Amiga, and Atari ST versions of the game. But that's more of an aesthetic choice preference than one being better quality than the other. And each of the criminal animations that pop up at various times when you're on the hunt are extremely well animated. They certainly could have tried to get away with less. The sound, on the other hand, is a bit more disappointing. Granted, none of the versions of the Enhanced Edition have particularly great sound, so it's not like the Genesis version is somehow lacking, it's just not a game that focuses on sound at all. Which honestly makes sense, considering that the game's original design goes back to the 1988 DOS PCs, which frequently were still using the PC speaker instead of an actual dedicated sound card. What few sound effects are included in the game are fine, but don't be surprised if the game seems to be a bit on the silent side. Playing Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego this week was a fun throwback to when I had originally played the game for the first time all the way back on the Commodore 64. The Genesis version is a more than competent version of the game, and the fact that it has virtually no loading times due to it being a cartridge-based title made it a great option if you didn't have a home computer available to play it on at the time. And honestly, the game completely holds up. About the only issue you'll encounter is playing the game in 2023 is the fact that the world has changed a bit over the last 30 years, so certain clues aren't going to quite line up if you're trying to just use your brain or Wikipedia. But hey, you've got that 1992 World Almanac to rely on, right? As a result, I'm giving Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego for Genesis 3 stars. It's definitely not a perfect game to be certain, but when it comes to providing an entertaining experience while also being very educational, there's few games out there that do it better.
Okay, and that was Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego for the Genesis. If you happen to see my review of the Master System version of the game back in episode 103, You may remember that I didn't have quite as positive a feeling about that version, and a lot of that came from the fact that I didn't like the changes that were made to that version of the game to try to make it appeal more to kids that wanted to have more action. The thing is Carmen Sandiego never needed that. And while there's definitely improvements that could be made to the formula, such as some of the tweaks that were made in the deluxe version on the PC, this version of the game was great as was. And I like the fact that the Genesis version was faithful to the property. Next time on Zilog and Moto, well, one of the problems when trying to cover a catalog of games where not all of them were originally sold in the United States is that some of those imported titles aren't exactly easy to find. Now, normally if I'm paying attention, I can find a copy ahead of a scheduled review on eBay if I don't have it already. But you see, that requires actually being prepared. And yeah, I was not a Boy Scout, if you can imagine. So I'll try to get that remedied soon, but in the meantime, we'll be looking at a Master System title that did get a United States release that I admittedly don't know very much about. But I have heard it referred to recently as boring, so fingers crossed that it doesn't live up to that hype. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 213. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.